Get Social. That's the name of my talk, and it's about implementing social login in your Symfony application. So to give a little bit more of an intro, this is my intro. Hi, so my name is Pauline, as you already heard. I'm a software engineer from Amsterdam, and I do mostly back in PHP in Symfony, but also since recently, like a year ago or 2 years ago, I've been doing React as well at Werkspot, which is a little bit like my builder in the UK, if you know of it. It's a sister company as well. So I'm a speaker, as you can see, but mostly about Git. So if you have any Git questions, feel free to hit me up. That's my handle on Twitter if you're into that sort of stuff. And I recently became June's mother. That's June. She's now 10 months old. And as you can see, she's very, very cute. And she's also the reason that I just jumped into the call halfway through, because she had to be put to bed. Hopefully she stays asleep. Okay, so back to the order of the day. Why would you want to implement social login in your Symfony application? Hopefully this is not a color that's super bright and super hard on your eyes at this hour. Okay, good. So why would you want to implement social login or sign up in your application? Okay, so if you have any type of conversion in your application, you're probably familiar with this funnel shape that POs and PMs might confront you with to signify kind of a drop-off in conversion in the whole user journey until conversion. So let's say you have a fancy hat store and there's a landing page and it lists all the fancy hats. And like the funnel shape, again, represents the amount of users that are dropping off at each step. So from that landing page, they select a nice hat, let's say this top hat. A few users have dropped off, no drama llama. And then next step is they add it to the basket. Another couple users drop off, but again, not super drastic. But then something happens and you lose a lot of users. A lot of users dropped off. So can you think of the moment that might happen? So for a lot of people, that is this step where they all of a sudden are presented with this big daunting form and they have to put in their customer details, full name and address, often billing address, shipping address, phone number for some reason, sometimes even gender, which is always a little puzzling to me, especially when it's something like fancy hats. Okay, so there's another option that makes it a little bit easier for your users, and that is social login or sign up. So this is an example from Etsy. They offer a pretty simple registration form. And then as an alternative, they offer to register you or log in with Google, Facebook, or Apple. So what happens is they take the information that you've already given to either Google, Facebook, or Apple, and they request that information so that they have it and they can continue with your order or registration or whatever. Okay, so there's a few benefits, of course. Biggest one is ease of use for the user, means higher conversion. People are not going to drop off as quickly. Then another kind of benefit that you might not think of as much is that there's no password required for this type of login. So returning users that may have forgotten their password, for instance, they might never convert again because they don't want to go through the whole reset password flow or whatever. And they don't have to think of a complicated password. So that's another small, but it's still an advantage. Okay. It's a national holiday here, by the way. It's King's Day, so please forgive me for drinking a beer. It's like, it's the law. You have to have a beer on King's Day. It's not. Okay. So if you're going to use social sign up / login, you're probably going to be using OAuth 2. So OAuth 2 is an authentication standard, and it's used by most of these third parties nowadays. So like if you're going to use Facebook, Apple, Google, GitHub, whatever, you're probably going to be using OAuth 2. So we're not going to go into the nitty gritty details of it, but this is what it is basically. And we'll kind of have a watered down explanation of what it does. So let's say you're a user and you have some personal details, like your name and address. That is seen as a resource in an OAuth 2 context. And that makes you, the user, the resource owner. Now you've registered an account with Twitter at some point, and you've given Twitter your resource, your personal information. So Twitter now is a resource server in this OAuth 2 context. They have your resource and they can serve it to whoever else. Then there's your client application, and it wants this resource. In order to get this resource, it has to ask Twitter, the resource server, using an access token. So first you need to obtain this access token. And simply put, Twitter first will check if the user is logged in with Twitter on that device, whether it be like a browser or your phone or whatever. So it will check if you're logged in, and if they're not logged in, then they just show you the regular Twitter login prompt. And then they check that, and then they go, okay. They check that against their settings of your client application, like, okay, is this client application registered with us, blah, blah, blah. And then if everything goes well, you get an access token, and then you can use that access token to get the resource. Thank you. Okay, so there's a few different ways to obtain the access token. So again, this is a very simplified diagram, but there's a few different ways of actually getting this access token from the points of the user logging in. And the most used one is probably the authorization code flow. You're hearing the cat flap, by the way, if you were wondering, my cat is coming in and out. So the authorization code flow will work completely kind of server-side, but with redirects. So your client application really just points redirect to the resource server and back, and you're doing that round tripping certain data. So for instance, one thing that's round tripped is the redirect URI. So your client application tells the resource server where to redirect the user to after this whole flow is over. And that's one thing that's completely round tripped back to you. And that's also one way that the resource server gives the authorization code back to you. Okay, so this is how that works. So your client redirects your user to the resource server, bearing credentials and the redirect URI. Then the resource server checks if the user is logged in, then sends the authorization code back. And then your client application redirects the user back again, bearing that same authorization code, which then Twitter will check, like, is this the same authorization code I've just sent? And if so, then that's fine, and it will send you the access token. And then you can do an API call or whatever you want to do to fetch the actual resource. Now, of course, there are some checks here, and there has to be some way for the resource server to manage kind of the authorization codes and the access tokens and stuff like that. So you have to register your client application with the resource server. And this is an example of what that looks like. This is Google. So on the left, you'll have the authorized redirect URIs for this authorization code flow. So this is basically, you have to list all the redirect URIs that are valid to send the user back to, because obviously they don't want someone to be redirected to a completely different application that you didn't intend to send them to. And then on the right, there's authorized JavaScript origins. So this is for a different flow, which is a completely server-side flow, or client-side flow, which I'm not going to go into because, first of all, I'm not fully sure how it completely works, something about CSRF tokens. But also, there's really no need to know it, because most third parties like Facebook, Google, blah, 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 will have like an SDK or some sort of JavaScript snippet that will help you handle these calls back and forth. Okay, so I'll show you a quick example of the Facebook SDK. So this is an example that comes straight from their documentation. If you're not super well versed in JavaScript, don't worry, I'll talk you through it. So the middle bit there, middle hunk there, as they call it in version control, is an SDK call. So the SDK object is called FB, and it has a method get login status, and like the get login status has a callback, very common in JavaScript, with the response that is received. And then with that response, you call your own function status change callback. So you handle that response with that method or with that function. That's the top function there. So the top function takes a response and just sees if the status sent back with the response is connected. And if so, it calls test API. And if not, it prints, please log into this web page. Kind of a bogus error message, but it's however you would handle them not being logged in, basically. Not being logged in or not authorizing your application, because I forgot to mention that not only would Twitter check if you're logged in to Twitter with that device, but also if you're actually allowing, of course, Twitter to share the data with your client application. So it can be those two things that like end you up in that please log into this web page state. But if it is connected, you're going to call test API, and you'll see that the bottom function test API has another SDK call, which is just an API call to an endpoint called /me, which is quite common in this OAuth 2 thing. /me is usually just the logged in users' basic resources, like first name, last name, for instance. And again, it has a callback that uses the response from that endpoint, and it prints the name and says, okay, thanks for logging in, blah, blah, blah. But of course, we're at Symfony UK, so chances are you're running a Symfony shop and you don't have a single page application where you just have to check the login status once, and the user can perform all sorts of stuff just on that page. You probably want to create a user in the backend, or make sure that user exists in your backend or whatever user management you use, and start a session so that the user can navigate through different pages in your application, and there's just a session. They don't have to constantly do this OAuth 2 flow. So what you could do is when they're connected, you could do a call to your backend. And just to your normal login endpoint, and then Symfony loads the user using a user provider, and you could take your standard user provider and kind of decorate that, like in this example, and just say load user by OAuth user response, and it takes the response, and then it tries to load an existing user from your standard user provider by username, which in this case would be email. And if that doesn't exist, it creates a new user and then returns that created user. So pretty easy peasy to just handle all of that in Symfony. You just have to make sure that you wire this implementation instead of your standard user provider for OAuth 2 stuff, and then you're finished. So the end, you might think. But no, of course not. We've just gotten started. We're only 15 minutes in. And as we all know, there's always trade-offs and caveats and all that stuff. So let's take a look at that. So one thing is, if you're going to go the SDK route, you have to be comfortable with and want to support JavaScript, because not all applications, of course, support JavaScript or want to support JavaScript. Every third party, and this is a big one, I think, has its own SDK, response object shape, stuff like that, its own endpoints and things like that. So if you're going to implement 3 different ones, then you have to somehow make that generic, or really, customize all the different SDK/API calls and transform the data, and blah, blah, blah. So that's quite a bit of effort. And, for whatever other reason, you might want to have your entire login flow handled server side. So of course there's bundles for this. There's two ones that I've found that are pretty well maintained and actively used. So there's the KMPU OAuth 2 client bundle and the HWI OAuth bundle. I think the KMPU OAuth 2 client bundle is the slightly newer one, but they are pretty similar in activity and maintenance, and also in functionality. Last time I checked, the only difference really was that HWI OAuth bundle is shipped with a register endpoint, and that user provider that we just had that implementation, so something like that. So it's shipped with that, but also last time I checked the documentation for that, which isn't very long ago, the documentation for that register endpoint wasn't super good, and it's pretty simple to make your own user provider as per the example before. So it's not that much of a difference really. But we are going to look at the HWI OAuth bundle. So let's see how it's configured. First, you're going to have to configure the firewalls that it's going to be active for. So here we have the security area firewall. And there's two, under OAuth, there's two resource owners, which is kind of a misnomer because the resource owner is the user. The resource server would be Facebook and Google. Regardless, resource owners, you have to put Facebook and Google or whatever else you do. Now the names can be whatever you want. The bundle doesn't really care. What the bundle does care about is that the name is the same as whatever comes after the check dash in the endpoint, because it kind of generates that endpoint based on that resource owner name as a parameter. And then as you can see a bit lower, as the OAuth user provider, you just add to your user provider that you've created, or the one that's shipped with HWI OAuth bundle, for instance. Then there's another bit of configuration under for the bundle specifically. So you have to tell it which firewall names it's active for. So in this case, it's only secured area. And then you have to configure the resource owners a bit more. So here's Google. Again, name doesn't matter. But another thing that does matter is the type, because the bundle does use this type to figure out which value objects to use for the response data. So the type is important and needs to match what the bundle is expecting, just so it knows how to kind of where to send, what endpoints to send the user to, and how to transform the data that it gets back. And then credentials, of course. And then there is the scope, which is basically the data that you want to be able to access. So this, if the user hasn't given you previous access to their resource, which they probably wouldn't have because you're just wiring this bundle just now, it would show up in that little modal that you probably know, where it's like, oh, it wants to share this and that information. And so that would be defined with the scope. So in this case, it would say like email, and profile is like first name, last name, for instance. It's just basic information. So pretty straightforward. And then there's Facebook, and you'll notice that looks pretty much the same except for the scope, which in this case is public profile and email. So it's the same data, but slightly different scope names, because that is just difference per resource server. Unfortunately, there's also not really a way to kind of make that generic for the bundle, because it doesn't know what kind of scopes every third party has, of course, and what you want to do. So you still have to kind of dig into the documentation for the specific resource servers there, but I mean, minimal effort, we can do it. And then there's some extra options that you can add, like a CSRF token, for instance. CSRF token, if you're using the SDK, is usually, if not always, again, I'm not sure how that client-side authorization process works exactly, but I think it uses a CSRF token as part of checking if you're really the client application that is doing these calls. And then there's a state parameter. So a state parameter is round trip like the redirect URI, for instance. So state parameter you can send as a query parameter, so just a question mark state or whatever, and then it equals whatever. And it's a standard in OAuth 2, so every OAuth 2 flow should be round tripping this thing. You can't round trip just at anything, just the redirect URI and the state thing, for instance. So you can send some application state and then you can expect it to come back at some point and then you can do stuff with it. That being said, I don't really understand the use case of configuring it here. And I'll kind of try to explain why. If anyone can think of a use case, I'd love to hear it. But one useful thing about state parameters is, for instance, take this example for Airbnb. If you try to register on Airbnb, you might want to register as either a host or a regular user who's trying to rent whatever for their vacation. So there's two different, specifically different users. So either a host or a regular user. So if you have an SPA, or it doesn't even matter if it's an SPA or not, but if you're the other way around, if it's server side, sorry, and you're doing those redirects, then you have to use the state parameter to be able to get this state of like, oh, did they click the host button or the regular user button, for instance. With an SPA, you wouldn't have to do that because you can keep that state client side because you're not losing any state redirecting. But with the redirects, you would be losing that state. So then you can kind of add the state parameter to the redirect and it will come back to you. And then you can figure out like, okay, is this person trying to log in / register as a host or as a regular user? So that's how that would work. So with that redirect flow, you get things sent back and forth. One of those things is a redirect URL. And then one of them is the state parameter with some state. So a common way to do this would be to have some sort of nonce that you store somewhere, for instance, in a key value storage like Redis or whatever, and then you assign some state to, or some data to that hash. So when you send the state and it comes back to you, you could do a lookup of that hash and kind of match, see what data is connected to that thing. So that's one way to keep the state that you had at the time of clicking, for lack of a better word. So this is quite handy because, of course, the state parameter is just one parameter, so it doesn't really allow you to send more things. You can try, but it's just not going to round trip. So this is a really nice and neat way to kind of be able to have more than one piece of data sending along with your state. Or you could really also just technically, it's a little bit ugly, but you can send just a JSON string with any data that you might want to have round tripped. What the HWA OAuth bundle does is I think you have to base64 JSON encode the data. So you have JSON and then you base64 that, and that is what you put in the state parameter. And HWA OAuth bundle makes sure that that's decoded and put in like a state value object. It's funny that I had to think about that because I actually wrote that part and I completely forgot how I did it. Oh, it might be useful to say that because I said I didn't really understand the use case of that configuration state bit. I did not implement that part because that would be kind of strange if I didn't understand the use case for something that I implemented myself. But okay. But again, that's kind of why I don't understand this addition to the configuration. Just because, you know, this configuration, that's a solid state. That's not going to change per button or per action that the user performs. Like that state is not going to change. So then I don't really see the point, as you could just probably just pop that into whatever configuration. So yeah, if anyone can think of a use case, please let me know. So this is what it would look like if you just implement these buttons in your twig templates or whatever. So at the top, you have one without a state parameter. You'll see that it just has a call to path, and you give it the service, which is Google, which is just the resource owner name, right? The one that you just made up yourself. It could be foobar or whatever. And then it'll compile the login path for that resource owner that you set up with a /login/check - whatever. And then the second one is the same, except this one has a state parameter, and you can just put the state parameter just hard coded kind of like next to your path, and then it will just be part of the link. It's pretty straightforward. And then if you're Airbnb, you can do something like this with your user provider. So if you take the user provider example that we had before, this time you can get the state from the resource owner value object that's shipped with the bundle. And that's that state value object that I was talking about that gets hashed and then unhashed, whatever. And then it tries to, just like before, it tries to load the user with your standard user provider. Now, I didn't put this in this example, but it would be nicer to check if the existing user, if it exists, actually matches the type of user that you're sending in your state. Because of course, if they're clicking the host button and they already exist as a regular user, then you want to handle that in some way. But yeah, just silly example anyway. And then if it doesn't exist, you can create a new user using that data and the user type state. So now you've registered that user as specifically as a host or as a regular user. Okay, so one last thing, really big caveat, kind of if you're working with dynamic environments and stuff, that we had some issues with, is that it's pretty hard to test. Because if you look at the authorized redirect URIs, you'll see that there's like a different URI for each environment that we have. We have production, we have dev, we have staging, and you even see some like very specific branch names. So if you're working with dynamic environments where you just deploy whatever to whatever test environment and it just gets randomly assigned a URL, unfortunately, you can't just do automated testing on that with the real resource servers, because they don't allow you, at least I've never found one, to allow like a wildcard redirect URI. And I'm sure there's a good reason for that. So I'd be surprised if you did find one that did allow that. But so what happens is that you have to manually add these redirect URIs for every different environment that you want to try this on. So you can't like dynamically add one or wildcard it or whatever. So that's super annoying, because then your automated tests would just fail randomly for different environments. So there's no real nice solution for this. Like Facebook does, for instance, offer a test user that you can use for automated testing. But of course, that's still not going to work with different environments if you have to set each of them up manually. So what we ended up having to do, and this is apparently the only real kind of semi-nice solution that you have to that you can implement, is to have your own little test OAuth provider, and then just set that as a test resource owner, and you do your automated testing on that. So we have a really simple test OAuth server that's based on, I think it's something like Node OAuth. I can't remember what the bundle is called, but you can check on the GitHub page, which I'll share later. But it's I'll show you how it works, but it's really simple. It really only supports Facebook right now as a type. If you want to use it and you want to support more types, just shoot me a message, or like create an issue or whatever, or create one yourself. But yeah, so it only supports the Facebook type, because obviously you're dealing with like a specific response object structure that the bundle needs to understand how to transform. So, yeah, again, it's super simple and barely any functionality yet, but this is basically how it works. You just start the server, and then you can just do really simple calls to it, and it just has bogus credentials, doesn't matter. So you just have this user, but sometimes you might want to, which was our case, we wanted to have different types of email addresses, so you can do that in the state. So this is that basic C4, and then like a JSON object with, I think it was test email is the property. And then you can have different email addresses. In our case, we wanted to do that because we had parallel test processes running. So we didn't want to be kind of we didn't want to have like conflicting tests, like where you create a user and then in the next test you're checking that they're, like you delete a user and then in the next test you check that they're there or whatever, and they have the same email address, so that conflicts. So we wanted to be able to like kind of send specific or get back specific email addresses per test. So that's one way you can do that. So yeah, feel free to use it if you want, and feel free to contribute, of course. And this is how you would kind of set up your own test server. So you just enter another resource owner. It's called test server. Again, yeah, name doesn't matter. But you do have to put the type as Facebook if you're going to use this one, because that's the only structure it's the only response object shape it supports. And then the scope is also extremely basic. So just for first name, last name, and email. And then the access token URL and the authorization URL. And the infos URL. Infos URL is just the user info URL, basically. I have to point to wherever your test server is running, and you can just have that running somewhere separately. And then, of course, you have to also add it here. And that's about it. So I hope that was useful. Sorry if I went ranty at times, because I haven't done this one in a while. So I hope it was a